There was a hush across the Seven Kingdoms when the letter announcing the union between Roose Bolton and Queen Cersei Lannister arrived in every great hall. Even in the most distant corners of the realm, knights and small folk alike found themselves murmuring about the unexpected match. The Boltons were known for their cruelty and cunning, and the Lannisters for their pride and power, but no one had ever quite imagined a marriage that so explicitly fused the two houses. Lords and ladies whispered of hidden machinations behind the marriage, for it reeked of more than mere politics. The gold of the Lannisters would augment the might of the Dreadfort, while the cunning-flaying practices of the Boltons could replace the heavy-handedness of the Lannister approach to governance, if, indeed, one could call tyranny governance. The entire realm trembled at the thought of what the pair might accomplish together. Soldiers in every tavern debated in hushed voices whether the king on the Iron Throne, who still called himself King Tommen though few recognized his true power, had condoned or was even aware of this shocking alliance. And so, on the cusp of a new upheaval, ravens flew ceaselessly from castle to castle, carrying tidings laced with dread. The day of the wedding itself dawned beneath an iron-gray sky, illuminated only by the pale winter sun. It took place in the great September of Baelor at King's Landing, a location that doubled as a statement, no matter the monstrous rumors about the Bolton patriarch, no matter the private disdain of many Lannisters who still drew breath. The ceremony would exude regality. Roose Bolton arrived clad in somber furs, the leathers dyed a deep, bruised crimson that only accentuated his pallid complexion. He wore no crown, but there was a subtle satisfaction in his eyes as he walked past the spectators. Standing by the altar, Grand Maester Pycelle, riddled by an uncharacteristic tremor in his hands, performed the rites. Each vow was a carefully measured incantation that bound two houses now poised to overshadow even the might of House Tyrell or the resurging Martells. When Cersei emerged from the alcove, draped in silk the color of wildfire and gold filigree, a hush fell over every lord and lady packed into the September. Though time and tragedy had left their marks upon her face, she still carried herself with the poise of a queen. Her green eyes glittered with a mixture of triumph and cold calculation, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. Even the faith that once would have judged her seemed powerless to resist the political magnitude of the match. The short ceremony itself could have ended with a polite round of applause and courtesies, but Lord Bolton, never one to pass on a menacing display, had prepared a spectacle. No one was quite sure where it originated. Some whispered of Myrish magisters, others suggested Qyburn's experiments. But it was said that during the feast, several exotic creatures were paraded through the hall, monstrous hybrids the likes of which King's Landing had never seen. Cersei's expression remained unreadable when these beasts were introduced. She only clapped politely, as if indifferent to the horror welling up in the pit of everyone else's stomachs. Still, the assembled lords feigned delight, aware that the slightest hint of offense might be enough to land them in the dungeons of the Red Keep or, worse yet, on Bolton's flaying table. The tension settled heavily over them. It was a wedding, yes, but it felt more like the quiet leading up to a storm. When the feasting was done and the night grew late, the small folk outside the Red Keep still spoke of the wedding. Some sneered in envy at the gold spent on the delicacies, others gaped in fear at the rumored cruelty that had found a place in the heart of the capital. She sold her soul for an ally, they hissed in corners. As if she had one left to sell, jested the braver ones. The laughter, though, never lasted long. The memory of Joffrey's malice was still fresh in King's Landing, and the notion of an alliance with the house that had orchestrated the Red Wedding felt like the stirring of a fresh nightmare. Yet even the cynics recognized that, for the moment, all they could do was keep their heads low and pray that the new alliance would target someone else first. No sooner had the wedding feast concluded than the new couple began to consolidate power. Roose, now titled Lord Protector of the Realm by a fluke of the King's Council, drifted into the recesses of the Red Keep's governance. He spent long hours meeting with Cersei behind closed doors. Whispers told of him subtly replacing guards with Bolton men, each sworn to the Dreadfort, their loyalty sealed by fear. His unwavering calm unnerved even the Lannister loyalists. There was a promise in his pale eyes that suggested they would serve him, or they would find themselves screaming in the blackness of some hidden chamber. And still, people told themselves that perhaps, just perhaps, nothing would change. It was a fantasy that dissolved the moment the first traitors, real or imagined, were discovered. The rumors spoke of a minor lord from the Stormlands who had made the mistake of questioning the Queen's new union. It was said he was taken in the dead of night, flung into a stable behind the Red Keep, and eviscerated by some silent, hooded figure wearing the sigil of a flayed man on his breast. When the carcass was discovered, a single scrap of parchment nailed to his forehead read simply, "Rebellion has consequences." The hush that fell over King's Landing that morning was different from the hush at the wedding. This new silence was pure terror. It clung to the tavern walls, to the markets, to the small council chambers where every Lannister bannerman weighed whether to stand with the new alliance or to discreetly find a way out. Yet few dared to speak openly. The City Watch had been told to clamp down on seditious rumors, and many a gold cloak was only too happy to enforce the new order with a mailed fist. Cersei's reactions were harder to gauge. In public, she mourned the tragedy of a lord lost to bandits or assassins. In private, it was rumored she did little more than raise a glass of arbor gold to her lips in sardonic acknowledgement. More than once, she was overheard in her solar remarking that the lords of Westeros were only ever obedient when they feared for their skin. She displayed little compassion, no surprise, and a certain intangible satisfaction that came with brandishing a new, more effective form of intimidation. Who needed the Kingsguard's white cloaks when there were the hounds of the Dreadfort ready to do your bidding without question? Meanwhile, tensions rose among the houses that once allied with the Lannisters. Lords who had served Tywin with unwavering devotion found themselves stripped of influence as Roose methodically replaced them with men of the North who bore the flayed man's standard. Cersei allowed it, or perhaps encouraged it, sipping her wine and offering only curt nods during Privy Council sessions. She had traded the illusions of friendship for the cold currency of fear. Anyone with sense recognized that the Lannister claws were as sharp as ever, but they now extended from a gauntlet lined with Bolton's spiked edges. The realm saw the forging of a new power structure unlike any it had known before, one that threatened to swallow up all opposition. And so, quietly, lord after lord bowed to House Bolton Lannister. Those who resisted vanished, sometimes with grisly remains discovered, other times simply disappearing without a trace. Roose's steady hand guided it all, while Cersei reigned as the figurehead queen, ensuring the Lannister name still resonated enough to keep the Iron Throne under her children. Across the continent, the name Bolton became as dreaded as the name Lannister had once been. In the cold barracks in Winterfell, whispers of the new queen's tyranny circulated among the Northerners. They wondered if House Bolton would soon bring its new queen to Winterfell, and if so, what nightmares might be unleashed upon the battered North, already weary from wars and betrayals. In the Riverlands, ravaged by the War of the Five Kings, rumors said Walder Frey's brood trembled at the possibility that Lord Bolton, now so intimately tied to Lannister power, might turn an even more punitive gaze upon them. For a moment, it seemed that the entire realm quaked under the quiet, methodical rule of a new kind of tyranny. One that did not rely on boisterous roars or prideful lions but on silent, calculating cruelty. Within the depths of the Red Keep, Roose Bolton found a new haunt, an abandoned series of tunnels rumored to have once housed the experiments of that twisted ex-maester, Qyburn. Roose took to wandering them at odd hours, accompanied only by a single torch and a silent sentinel from the Dreadfort. The gloom of those subterranean chambers suited him, the dripping walls reflecting a watery echo of screams that had once resounded there. The Bolton men soon found themselves at home, setting up hidden cells for those who needed questioning. At night, some claimed they heard faint cries from below the floors of the keep, but the gold cloaks stationed above simply shrugged off questions and told any curious souls to move along. And so a new reign of quiet horror took root, unspoken and unchallenged, because no one dared to challenge it. Yet for all the fear and obedience Roose Bolton inspired, he was but half the new power. The other half held court in the highest spire of the Red Keep, sipping wine from her golden goblet, still wearing her regal dresses embroidered with Lannister lions. Cersei looked upon her new husband with eyes that flickered between disdain and grudging respect. She recognized that Roose offered her a formidable shield against any who would bring her downfall. Yet she was too proud a woman to cede the spotlight. She found subtle, cunning ways to reassert her dominance in the capital. She kept the Tyrells at bay with carefully planted rumors, stoking tensions wherever she could. For if she were not beloved, then she would be formidable. And if she was no longer formidable alone, then she would be so with the Boltons by her side. In all the Seven Kingdoms, there was no shortage of speculation about how long such a partnership could endure. Roose was infamous for his cold, calculating nature. Cersei was equally renowned for her pride and her thirst for absolute control. If either made the slightest misstep, the other might slip a knife between their ribs. But until that day came, until the fragile alliance shattered under the weight of its own brutality, all of Westeros would find itself standing on a precipice, uncertain whether the realm's darkest days were behind or just beginning. And under the looming shadow of the new Bolton Lannister union, everyone, lords, small folk, and even the clergy, feared it was the latter. Weeks passed, and the realm began to shudder anew, unsure of how the new tyranny would reveal itself next. Whispers drifted in from the outlying regions that pockets of rebellion were forming. In the Reach, some younger lords quietly conspired against the notion of Bolton cruelty spreading to their fertile fields. In the Vale, Lady Erin's regents weighed whether to remain neutral or to offer covert support to those who dared oppose King's Landing. Dorne, simmering in its customary resentment of Lannister rule, watched every Raven's message with a readiness to bear fangs at the first sign of an overreach. Yet so far, each region waited for a champion to rally around. And champions were in short supply. The War of the Five Kings had culled many of the realm's strongest personalities. Through it all, Roose and Cersei maintained a veneer of calm. The small council sessions ran on schedule, decrees went out to the realm that made superficial promises of stability, and merchants were granted new licenses to ply their wares in King's Landing. But beneath that polite mask, a new wave of terror brewed, all the more insidious because of the silence. The King's Landing rumor mill now claimed that Lady Margaery Tyrell had been placed under a form of house arrest in the Red Keep for daring to question a policy that increased taxes on the Reach. Another story told of a blacksmith from Flea Bottom who had vanished after forging an illicit blade for some unknown conspirator. It was said the blacksmith's screams were heard echoing through the tunnels for days until the cries choked on death itself. At last, after weeks of carefully measured steps, the newlywed couple, Queen Regent Cersei and Lord Protector Roose Bolton, took a definitive stride toward the next stage of their dominion. By a royal decree sealed with the sigils of both the Lion and the Flayed Man, every region of Westeros was to be subjected to a series of loyalty assessments. Inspectors, half of them clad in Lannister crimson and the other half wearing the Dreadfort's Flayed Man emblem, were dispatched to the great houses to demand a renewed oath of fealty. Each region's compliance would be documented and returned to King's Landing. Behind the official language of unity lay an unspoken threat. Refusal to comply would be an invitation to these twin horrors to descend upon any seat of power that did not bend the knee. Many houses, fatigued by war and leaderless, grumbled but acquiesced. A handful of braver or more stubborn lords resisted. One by one, these outliers drew the attention of the new regime. The first test came in the Westerlands, ironically enough, from a rebellious Lannister cousin who believed herself the rightful lady of Casterly Rock in the absence of a competent male heir. She refused the inspector's entry and claimed that Cersei's union with Bolton was an affront to the memory of Tywin. The retort from King's Landing arrived in the form of a retinue led by none other than a Bolton captain named Allard Greymond, a bastard from the north rumored to be as vicious as Ramsay Bolton once was, though less prone to reckless violence. He demanded entry at the gates of the rebellious Lady's Keep. When she turned him away again, he unleashed a wave of flayed corpses catapulted over the castle walls in the dead of night, each one a silent promise of what was to come. By morning, the gates opened. The defiance crumbled. The inspectors walked through halls reeking of terror, and the lady who had once claimed rightful inheritance was escorted to King's Landing in chains. There, she was forced to kneel in public before the Iron Throne, her once proud eyes heavy with defeat. The Queen Regent and her husband exchanged a thin-lipped smile from their dais. None dared question further, lest they be next to kneel or to scream. The second test came in the north, where certain bannermen still scorned the Boltons for their betrayal of House Stark. Though the Starks had all but vanished from the political landscape, their memory lingered in the hearts of the Northerners like a ghost. Lord Serwyn and his men refused to swear fealty once more to the Boltons, claiming they had already done so under duress. This time, no parade of flayed corpses was required. Instead, a letter arrived, sealed with the joint sigils of the Lannister Lion and the Bolton Flayed Man. It simply read, "Lord Serwyn, you have one son. Return your oath, or you will see him delivered piece by piece." The Serwyn forces bent the knee within a day. No blood was spilled, and yet the chill of the threat lingered in every corridor of that keep. The dread that House Bolton instilled was matched only by the knowledge that House Lannister, with all its resources, would ensure the realm's eyes looked away from any atrocity. And so it went from the Iron Islands to the Stormlands, from the Vale to the Reach. Any hint of disobedience met with swift, silent retribution. Even the Targaryen loyalists who still clung to the hope of dragons returning fell quiet, for they had no champion to rival this new union of cunning and cruelty. Word traveled fast that the queen was not simply forging alliances. She was forging a new world order in which every corner of Westeros would answer to her demands, enforced by Roose Bolton's unsparing methodology. The Iron Throne no longer needed an overt demonstration of power. Small, methodical horrors were enough. Each isolated incident of flaying or blackmail or disappearance built up an unassailable bulwark of fear. In the tapestry of Westeros's history, it was a design stitched with blood and terror, but it held the realm in a strange, tormented peace, at least for now. Meanwhile, Cersei's children found themselves caught in the crossfire of this new world. Tommen, the boy king, grew quieter by the day. He was now surrounded by guards loyal to Bolton, each one more taciturn and intimidating than the last. Even Ser Gregor Clegane, that monstrous sentinel who had once sworn fealty to Cersei, seemed uneasy in the presence of Bolton's men. It was rumored that the boy grew sickly, often feigning headaches to avoid public appearances. Myrcella, in Dorne, was rumored to be receiving letters from her mother urging her to maintain good relations with the Martells and to avoid offering any sign of weakness. Yet the princess was more or less a captive in all but name, a living piece of potential negotiation should the alliance with the Boltons turn sour. And as for the possibility of another claimant rising, like the rumored Aegon Targaryen or the exiled Daenerys across the Narrow Sea, well, that seemed distant and half-forgotten in the face of the immediate terror being sown at home. In the corridors of the Red Keep, the old courtiers, those who had served under the reigns of Aerys, Robert, and even Joffrey, would gather in dark corners and mutter that they had never seen a rule quite like this. Robert's cruelty had been overshadowed by his disinterest, Joffrey's sadism by his impulsive immaturity, and the Mad King's mania by the revolt it provoked. But the new rule was cold, systematic, and unstoppable. There would be no immediate revolt, no popular uprising. It would take time, cunning, and an audacity few possessed to topple such a pair. And as the weeks turned into months, it seemed that fear was an infinitely renewable resource. Yet, as autumn deepened into winter, new complexities arose. The crown's coffers, already strained from the war, began to show signs of depletion once more. The Tyrell gold from Highgarden was no longer as freely offered as it once had been under Mace Tyrell's attempts to ingratiate himself into the royal family. The houses that had once paid taxes begrudgingly to King's Landing found themselves drained by the repeated loyalty demands. Merchants, choked by the increased fees and the knowledge that any slight infraction could mean imprisonment, started pulling their wares from the city or fleeing by sea. The first trickle of economic crisis emerged, and with it, tension simmered behind the scenes of the Red Keep. For all Roose's cunning and Cersei's thirst for power, coins did not appear from thin air. The Iron Bank of Bravos, once a looming figure in the realm's politics, began to send pointed letters, reminding the crown of debts unpaid. Winter was approaching, and with it, the need to secure more resources. Ruling through terror could only sustain them if they had the means to feed and supply both the capital and the regions that had bent the knee. They found themselves cornered into a predicament: expand their brutality outward to squeeze more from the lords, or attempt some measure of diplomacy to keep the realm afloat. Cersei wanted to rule with an iron fist, to show no mercy. She wanted to see the gold from every corner of Westeros flow unabated to her coffers. Roose, however, recognized the dangers of pushing the great lords too far. Even fear had its limits. If the entire realm was starved, if no coin circulated, the people would become desperate enough to risk rebellion. And so the couple clashed in private. They spoke behind closed doors, voices hushed yet sharp. They debated how to handle the Tyrells, how to manipulate the new Warden of the West, how to keep the Vale and Dorne at bay without inciting outright conflict. Servants would sometimes pass by the heavy oak doors and catch snippets of their arguments. Cersei's raised tone, spitting curses upon anyone who dared defy her, and Roose's calmer, cooler baritone, reminding her that an effective lord never ruined his praise hide prematurely. They fought with words as lethal as swords, but always, they emerged from their chambers with a semblance of unity. The facade was maintained, if barely. In the darkest hours of the night, Cersei sometimes found herself wandering the deserted halls, a goblet of wine in hand, thinking of the father she had once both feared and idolized. Would Tywin have allowed this marriage? Would he have orchestrated it himself? Or would he have crushed the Boltons for their insolence? She recalled how easily Tywin had orchestrated the Red Wedding, forging that monstrous pact with the Freys and the Boltons. Perhaps he would have condoned her choice of Roose as a husband, had he still been alive. Or perhaps he would have told her she had miscalculated. Alone with her thoughts, she cursed the day Tyrion had loosed that fatal crossbow bolt, for her father's death had left her to navigate this precarious game without his unwavering presence. In another quiet corner of the keep, Roose might be found similarly ruminating, if he truly possessed the capacity for regret or introspection. More likely, he was weighing odds, evaluating how long Cersei's partnership was worth maintaining before it became a liability. For House Bolton was never known for unswerving loyalty. It was known for seizing opportunities in the dead of night. As the cold winds began to swirl through the streets of King's Landing, those within the Red Keep felt that a shift was coming. The marriage that had seemed so unholy and unstoppable still reigned supreme, but cracks were beginning to show. The realm had not known peace for years, and it yearned for relief, for a champion, for anything to break the chokehold that the Bolton-Lannister alliance was tightening around the Seven Kingdoms. Some prayed to the Seven for deliverance. Others, in hushed corners, held out hope for the rumored Dragon Queen across the sea or for the return of some lost Stark heir in the north. And still others simply surrendered to their fate, for such was the weight of fear that pressed upon them. If the new monarchy demanded it, then they would bow. If Roose Bolton and Cersei Lannister turned their gaze upon them, they would kneel. And if they were summoned in the dead of night, they would vanish without a whimper, becoming another thread in the tapestry of quiet terror that defined this unholy reign. The cold nights grew longer, and so did the list of disappearances. There was a brazenness to the cruelty now. Men flayed and left to hang at the gates of smaller keeps. Women accused of sedition vanishing into the bowels of the Red Keep, never to be seen again. A hush enveloped taverns, markets, even the broader thoroughfares of the city. And in the north, the Bolton seat at the Dread Fort grew in power, hosting gatherings of lords who had no option but to obey. The old alliances of the north, once held together by the Starks, fell in line. Few dared speak the name of the direwolf now that the flayed man was so close to the Lannister lion. Some weeks after the marriage, in a rare moment of respite, Cersei hosted a gathering of the court in the throne room. The air was stagnant with apprehension. She sat on the Iron Throne, flanked by a row of new Bolton guards whose faces seemed carved from stone. Tommen, the Boy King, was conspicuously absent. Roose stood off to the side, his presence as strong as steel. Courtiers approached to bow and present their petitions, requests for lesser holdings, for trade privileges, for pardons. One by one, Cersei listened with a bored expression, occasionally casting a sidelong look at Roose. At times, he inclined his head, signaling whether he found a petition worthy or not. Invariably, the petitioners left with either an uneasy flicker of hope or the pallor of someone who feared the worst. Then, near the close of the session, an emissary from Braavos arrived, robed in the rich fabrics of a foreign land with a face carved by years of calculating negotiations. He bore an ultimatum from the Iron Bank: repay the accrued debt or face dire financial isolation. The entire court went silent as the emissary's words echoed. For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew the gravity of the bank's power. Even the mightiest kings had been undone by their inability to appease Braavos. Cersei's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing like a predatory cat. She was about to speak when Roose intervened. In a cool, steady voice, he promised the emissary that the crown would honor its debts, with the first major payment to be delivered as soon as the realm's war-torn economy stabilized. He spoke with such practiced calm that the emissary nodded, cautiously appeased. The courtiers exhaled, not quite a sigh of relief, for they sensed the undercurrent of conflict between the two figures on the dais. As soon as the hall was cleared and night fell, it was said that those who passed the queen's solar heard angry muttering. Cersei raged that it was not the Iron Bank's place to threaten her in her own throne room. Roose, with his measured tone, reminded her that the Iron Bank had far-reaching influence and that some alliances require more than terror. Morning dawned gray once again, as if the skies themselves anticipated looming strife. Messengers came and went, carrying secret instructions to the crown's functionaries, to lords in the field, and to spy masters embedded in various corners of Westeros. Thus, the uneasy winter set in fully, a season made even bleaker by the specter of a brutality that had taken root in King's Landing. And so it would remain until some flash of rebellion ignited, or until the dark marriage of House Bolton and House Lannister consumed the realm entirely. No one saw the next blow coming, but perhaps they should have. Fear breeds caution, and caution spawns conspiracy. In the hushed corners of taverns, in the faded corridors of older castles, in the flickering candlelight of hidden chapels, the seeds of rebellion slowly took root. And those seeds would need only the slightest spark to burst into flame. Because in a world where terror reigned unchecked, the possibility of hope, however slim, could become the most dangerous weapon of all. Yet for now, the Bolton-Lannister alliance stood unchallenged, its cruelty sharpened with each passing day. Roose and Cersei, bound by wedding vows and a shared thirst for dominion, had cast a net of silent horrors across the Seven Kingdoms. The court functioned, the laws were upheld, at least in name, and the realm trudged on in sullen subjugation. If there was an undercurrent of rebellion, it remained subdued, overshadowed by the consequences that had been demonstrated so clearly since the wedding feast. And so, across the land, men and women of every station weighed their options, balancing loyalty against despair, fear against the faint glimmer of freedom. Winter, with its long nights and unforgiving storms, blanketed the realm in chill darkness, echoing the gloom that now permeated King's Landing and beyond. If a dawn was coming, it was far away indeed, and the new rulers of Westeros seemed determined to ensure that when it did arrive, it would arrive at a kingdom shaped by the savage melding of two fearsome houses, where the gold of House Lannister reflected not honor, but the blood spilled by House Bolton's flayed man. Time marched on, the steady heartbeat of a realm held in thrall, and with each pulse, the brutality spread further. Yet the story was far from concluded. For in the darkest shadows, rebellion often finds its initial spark. And in the gloom that had settled over Westeros, with winter's teeth bared, all it would take was the right spirit, the right coalition of the desperate and the daring, to challenge the monstrous union that now held the Iron Throne. The wind that blew in from Blackwater Bay carried a restless chill, as if the very air sensed the uneasy balance of power gripping the Seven Kingdoms. King's Landing had grown quieter since the day the royal decree of loyalty assessments spread across the realm, yet the silence that reigned was hardly a sign of peace. It was the hush of a city steeped in dread, where each day seemed tenser than the last. The watchmen who once gossiped outside taverns now kept their mouths shut, and the servants who bustled in the corridors of the Red Keep walked with their heads bowed, as if fearful that even a stray glance might be misinterpreted by the new masters. No one doubted that the ultimate power in the realm lay in the hands of the newlywed Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister, and her husband, Lord Protector Roose Bolton. Tommen Baratheon, the Boy King, was largely invisible. On rare occasions he was trotted out to preside at court or sign a decree, but even then, his face was wan and his eyes had lost the light of innocence. He sat perched on the Iron Throne while his mother and her northern consort stood just behind him, like twin shadows overshadowing the realm. The day's audiences were always kept short and strictly monitored. It was said that Cersei and Roose had perfected a silent language of subtle nods and fleeting glances, one that the entire court had been forced to interpret if they wished to survive. When Roose wanted to deliver a punishment, he would tilt his head ever so slightly. When Cersei wished to humiliate a petitioner, she would tap her index finger against her goblet. Small signals, but loaded with threat. The recipients of these signals invariably left the throne room with trembling limbs or tear-streaked faces. The Bolton men who patrolled the streets of King's Landing had begun wearing black leather gloves and carrying an emblem of the flayed man upon their armor. Whenever they passed, the small folk scurried aside. Whispers in the alleys spoke of flayings carried out within the city's walls, people vanishing into deserted cellars, never to emerge again. The City Watch, now forced to collaborate with these northern soldiers, found itself complicit in unspeakable acts of intimidation. Even the gold cloaks who were once loyal to the Lannister regime felt the icy terror that came with the presence of these silent executioners. They had seen blood before, this was King's Landing, after all, but the casual cruelty of Bolton's men unsettled even the hardest veterans. Still, brutality alone could not keep the realm unified. Supplies were running thin, and winter crept closer each day. The Crown's gold reserves did not replenish themselves. The Iron Bank's envoy came and went, never quite satisfied, returning to Braavos with loaded but uncertain promises. Lords across the continent grumbled under the weight of renewed taxes and tariffs. The Tyrells, kept in check by the hostage-like status of Marjorie in King's Landing, did not openly revolt, but their patience grew thinner by the day. Meanwhile, in the north, resentment simmered. House Bolton had never truly been beloved among the northern bannermen, and the old allegiance to the Starks lingered like a stubborn ghost. Still, fear of retribution kept even the boldest lords in line. It was said that if a man so much as whispered discontent, the ravens would carry the news to the dread fort, and from there it would travel straight to Roose Bolton in the capital. The Queen Regent kept her apartments in the Tower of the Hand, having decided that no one else was worthy of occupying the space once held by her father, Tywin. She spent her days examining accounts, quarreling with the Master of Coin, and entertaining the notion of forging new alliances that might keep her afloat. Each night, however, she indulged in a different routine. She would summon Roose Bolton to her presence. Some nights, they would drink in silence, a stale and joyless ritual that neither seemed eager to break. Other nights, their arguments rose in pitch, only to die away when both realized that, while they might despise each other's methods, they were bound in a common cause, controlling the Iron Throne and keeping their enemies at bay. On a frigid evening near the year's end, Cersei found herself at her table, a map of Westeros spread before her, golden rings on her fingers tapping the parchment. "The Vale has pledged loyalty in word," she remarked, "but I've heard rumors that Bronze Yohn Royce is gathering men under the pretext of increasing the Vale's defenses. The area is impenetrable even for our combined forces, and if they ever decide to close ranks, we might not be able to root them out." Roose stood across the table, silent for a moment, considering. He wore the same dark leather he had donned for the wedding feast, trimmed with fur. The flickering candlelight played off his pale eyes, giving him the look of a man dissecting a problem from all angles. "We should not underestimate the Vale," he said at length. "They've kept to themselves thus far, but isolation can breed discontent. We cannot allow them to think they have the luxury of ignoring us. The next round of loyalty assessments will have to press them." Cersei frowned, brushing a strand of golden hair from her forehead. "Press them how? If we provoke them, they might form alliances with the Riverlands or the North. Then we'd have to march an army up into their mountains in the dead of winter." Roose took a step closer to the map. His finger trailed along the eastern coast. "An army might not be necessary. Not if we place the right individuals in their midst. The Vale is ruled by a child lord and managed by regents. Weak leadership, susceptible to infiltration. A bit of sabotage or intimidation could bring them to heel without risking our forces." She sipped her wine, her green eyes narrowing in approval. "I see you've been paying attention to the lessons of King's Landing politics. I've always favored a careful approach," Roose murmured, "when it suits my ends." Cersei almost smiled but stopped herself. She could not afford warmth, not here, not now. The realm saw them as a monstrous pair, and perhaps that was their greatest asset. "We will send the new Master of Whisperers to the Vale. He can sow discontent among their lords. If that fails, we will make an example of one of their minor houses." Roose nodded, silently acknowledging the plan. Though they might harbor private animosity, in matters of strategy they were disturbingly in sync. With that settled, he turned his gaze to the rest of the map, eyes lingering on the shape of the Riverlands. "The Freys have grown restless. They feel neglected, overshadowed by the Boltons in the north and by the Lannisters in the south. Old Walder is losing his grip. If the Freys sense an opportunity to assert themselves, they might become a nuisance." Cersei snorted. "Those treacherous curs. My father used them, you used them, we all used them. Now they're the least loved house in Westeros. Let them languish in the Twins. They can bark all they like, but they're surrounded by enemies too. The Mallisters, the Blackwoods, the Brackens, none of them trust the Freys. If Walder tries to stir trouble, we can always remind him that he has more heirs than he can count, and each is expendable." "An apt threat," Roose said, "but it will need to be repeated from time to time. The Freys have short memories and large ambitions." Cersei sighed. "They'll fall in line or they'll suffer. We have more pressing matters. The Iron Bank demands more gold and the Reach withholds some of its harvest. They claim a poor yield, but I suspect they're lying. Marjorie must still have some influence." At the mention of Marjorie's name, an ember of irritation flickered in Cersei's expression. She had never fully conquered her resentment for the Tyrell girl. Though Marjorie was now effectively a captive, forced to remain in King's Landing, Cersei still felt a gnawing unease. Not all prison bars were made of steel, some might be undone by cunning words and alliances behind closed doors. She would not underestimate the Tyrell Rose. When they had concluded their strategic discussion, Cersei dismissed Roose with a curt nod. Her husband withdrew as silently as he had come, leaving her with only the crackling fire for company. She stared at the map for a long while, feeling the weight of rulership press heavily upon her chest. She had dreamed all her life of power, but now that she had it, it was a precarious throne indeed, perched on the edge of a knife. Any slip could send it all toppling into chaos, and though she had bound herself to a man of flaying knives and quiet menace, she knew that the real threats lay beyond the walls of King's Landing. They were in the hearts of lords who were desperate, cunning, or both, waiting for the moment to strike. The next day dawned bleak, with clouds hanging low over the city. The atmosphere in the Red Keep matched the skies, heavy and foreboding. Yet the day began with an unexpected arrival, a raven from Winterfell bearing the dire wolf seal of House Stark. This alone was cause for alarm, for the Boltons had claimed the north, and House Stark was believed to be all but extinct. The letter, carried by a shivering courier, was presented immediately to Roose Bolton while he took his breakfast with a handful of trusted captains. He read the parchment with an inscrutable expression, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then he folded it neatly, quietly dismissed his men, and made his way to Cersei's solar. She was halfway through her morning wine, reading reports from the Master of Coin, when he strode in. The Queen Regent looked up, annoyance flickering in her eyes at the interruption, but she gestured for him to speak. Without a word, he handed her the parchment. Her gaze flickered over the unfamiliar scrawl. To Lord Bolton, Warden of the North, and Queen Regent Cersei Lannister, I write in the name of House Stark and the memory of my forebears. Winterfell has been claimed in the name of the trueborn heirs of Eddard Stark. The North remembers. If you wish to dispute this rightful claim, come and face us. The snows are our allies, and winter has set in. The flayed man will find no welcome here. Signed in the name of the wolf. Cersei's grip tightened, crumpling the edge of the parchment. Which imbecile dares to sign a letter in the name of House Stark? We should not dismiss it as an idle jest, Roose replied coolly. The seal is authentic enough, and there are rumors, tales of the Stark girls being alive or the bastard Jon Snow once at the wall. If someone has rallied the northern houses under a false Stark banner, it might be enough to cause us considerable trouble. She tossed the letter onto her desk. Then stop them. Send your men. Send Ramsay's old legion or whoever is left. We cannot have a resurgence of Starks now. Roose's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or worry, though it was always difficult to read him. I will send men, but remember, traveling north in deep winter is no easy feat. Armies can die in the snow before they even face the enemy. Besides, if this is an actual Stark resurgence, or a ruse with a measure of support from northern bannermen, we'll need a more thorough approach. I have to handle this carefully. She stood, saying, handle it however you must. We can't allow a rebellion to take root there. If the North rises, the Vale might be encouraged to do the same, and then the Riverlands. I understand, Roose cut in, his voice never rising above that measured calm. I will prepare a force. Let the mountain lords remain here in King's Landing in case the Vale stirs. I will call upon what remains of the Bolton levy at the Dreadfort. She paused, brow furrowed. And who will command it? I will. Cersei spun. You will go yourself? You would leave me here alone with all these snakes at court. Roose inclined his head, acknowledging her point. If the letter is true, it requires my personal attention. The northern lords will only submit if they see my face. Even fear has its limits when you're dealing with men who have survived harsh winters all their lives. Unless you want me to leave half the realm to its own devices, I must go. For a moment, she said nothing, torn between the desire to keep him close, where she could monitor him, and the necessity of crushing any spark of rebellion. Very well, she said at last. But do not linger. I will not have you freezing to death in the snows and leaving me to face a realm in chaos. He gave her a slight bow, his expression as unreadable as ever. I appreciate your concern. Concern? She snorted. I can ill afford to lose my best shield. He turned and strode away, the echoes of his footsteps following him down the corridors. Cersei remained by the window, staring out at the city sprawl beneath her. Even from this distance, she could see the smoky haze that hung over Flea Bottom, the labyrinth of cramped hovels. Somewhere among those streets, no doubt, enemies lurked. Spies, assassins, malcontents, all of them waiting for a moment of weakness. With Roose gone, would they dare attempt something? Would Marjorie Tyrell slip a knife into her back, or perhaps some cunning cell's word would creep into her chambers in the night? The Queen Regent pursed her lips. She would not be so easily bested. The marriage to Roose might have given her an extra layer of security, but she had survived even before forging that monstrous alliance, and she was prepared to do so again. In the following days, the Red Keep was abuzz with talk of the Northern campaign. Quietly, Roose assembled a cadre of troops who had accompanied him from the Drevfort, augmented by a few Lannister men eager to prove their worth. The looming fear of a Stark revival chilled them all. Even the thought of traveling to the north in winter was enough to set many tongues wagging with doom-laden gossip. But Roose gave no fiery speech, no rallying cry. He simply sent out ravens, arranged supplies, and one early morning the assembled force began its march out of King's Landing. Cersei watched from a balcony as they rode away. She noted that Roose traveled in the midst of the column, his dark banners emblazoned with the flayed man, mingling with the lion of House Lannister in a joint standard. An uneasy union, she thought, and one that might not last if the North turned truly hostile. The column dwindled into the distance until it was just a thin line, disappearing beyond the city gates. Cersei exhaled. Now the capital, and indeed the entire realm, would see how well she could maintain power in her husband's absence. That same evening she summoned the court to the throne room. Word had spread quickly. Lord Bolton had marched north, leaving the Queen Regent alone at the helm. Courtiers came dressed in their finery, uncertain whether they were to witness a triumphant declaration or a purge of potential traitors. The flickering torches illuminated the great hall, revealing the faces of ambassadors, minor lords, and important functionaries. The Kingsguard stood at attention, and behind Cersei, stationed with stony resolve, were the black leather-clad Bolton men who had been left in the city. Cersei, draped in a gown of shimmering red and gold, addressed the assembly. "Lords and ladies," she began, her voice echoing across the hall, "I bring you news of a treasonous attempt in the north. Certain malcontents have claimed the name of Stark and seek to rally disloyal houses. Lord Bolton has traveled to crush this folly, and I remain here as your Queen Regent to oversee the stability of the realm. Let it be known that any who would question the legitimacy of our rule shall face the same fate as these northern rebels. The Iron Throne stands firm, backed by the might of House Lannister and House Bolton. Let none doubt our resolve." The murmurs in the hall were hushed but intense. Some looked fearful, others looked intrigued, and a few seemed quietly determined. Cersei's gaze flicked over them, catching the fleeting expressions of Margaery Tyrell, who stood with a small retinue of ladies. Margaery's face was as inscrutable as ever, but there was a flicker in her brown eyes that spoke of either pity or resolution. In that moment, Cersei realized that if there was any threat in King's Landing to her reign, it might well come from the Tyrell girl. Before dismissing the court, Cersei announced a new tax on all shipping vessels entering Blackwater Bay. She declared it a necessary measure to fund the suppression of northern treason. A few merchants in attendance tried to protest, but the Queen's withering glare silenced them. Across the hall, she spotted Ser Kevan Lannister, her uncle, who had once tried to counsel her against rash decisions. He caught her eye and gave the barest shake of his head as if to say she was pushing the realm too far. She ignored him. She had no need for Kevin's timidity. When the audience ended, Cersei retired to her solar. There she found Pycelle waiting, wringing his spotted hands. "Your Grace," he quavered, "1,000 pardons for disturbing you, but we have urgent word from the Iron Bank. They are displeased with the new war taxes and fear it might hamper trade. They also," she held up a hand. "Enough. I care little for the Iron Bank's feelings. They've already threatened us. They can wait for their gold like the rest of us wait for summer. Is that all?" He lowered his gaze. "Well, they also threaten to withhold lending to certain houses that might let them." She waved him off. "I will speak to them when the time is right. For now, we show no weakness. If the realm sees that I cower before Braavosi bankers, my authority will falter." With a dismissive gesture, she dismissed him. Once alone, she paced the solar, sipping her wine. If Roose were here, he might have cautioned her to tread carefully with the Iron Bank. Then again, he might have offered some measured solution. But Roose was far away, riding north to handle the mythical resurgence of House Stark. She had no illusions that the campaign would be simple. The Northern Lords were a proud, stubborn lot, and winter gave them an advantage. Still, she trusted Roose's cold brutality to handle them. If he failed, it would be his hide flayed, not hers. Yet she needed him to succeed for her own sake and for that of her children, if indeed there was any future left for them to inherit. Days slipped by, and the capital grew restless. The new taxes weighed heavily on merchants who passed the costs down to the common folk, raising prices on everything from bread to salted fish. King's Landing had never been wealthy in good times, but now it neared the brink of desperation. Several shipments from the Reach were delayed due to inclement weather, or so the Tyrell messengers claimed. In truth, it was likely an orchestrated effort to force the crown to treat them with more leniency. Meanwhile, refugees from the war-ravaged countryside trickled into the city, hoping for some semblance of security. They found only high prices, suspicious guards, and an undercurrent of fear that made life in the capital scarcely more appealing than the uncertain fields beyond. On the 10th day after Roose's departure, a hush descended on the Red Keep when a young officer in Bolton colors arrived half-dead at the gates, carrying dispatches meant for the Queen. The guards admitted him, and he collapsed in the courtyard. Cersei hurried down from her solar, flanked by gold cloaks and Bolton men. As the maesters rushed to tend the wounded messenger, she snatched the letter he held. It was marked with Roose Bolton's own careful hand. She read it by torchlight, ignoring the concerned faces gathered around. We have engaged pockets of resistance north of Moat Cailin. The cold is worse than anticipated. Our supply lines are hindered. Some houses refuse to open their gates for provisioning, claiming loyalty to the so-called Stark claimant. We lost men to ambush near the Fever River. My scouts report rumors of a large host near Winterfell, though I cannot confirm it yet. I continue to press forward, but progress is slow. Prepare for additional levies if needed. The north is less docile than we hoped. Cersei crumpled the parchment in frustration. Already, the campaign was running into obstacles. She looked at the messenger's half-frozen form. His lips were blue, and the maesters were trying to warm him by the brazier. It struck her that Roose had chosen to send this man on a perilous journey through the winter wilderness just to deliver these words. That alone spoke volumes about how dire the situation might be. She turned to the captains who stood around her. "Assemble the council," she commanded, "and see this man is fed and tended to." They bowed and scattered, leaving her with a swirl of conflicting emotions. Perhaps Roose's methods, while cruel, might not be enough to quell the North if the people truly believed a Stark had returned. The thought sent a tremor of apprehension through her. She had witnessed firsthand how illusions of hope could drive men to bravery beyond reason. Back when the War of the Five Kings began, the North had rallied behind Robb Stark, the young wolf, and inflicted serious defeats on the Lannister armies before he was betrayed. What if the specter of the Stark name could rekindle that fire in the hearts of the Northern Lords? The council assembled in the Great Hall, where a dim row of torches cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Cersei sat at the head of a long table, flanked by Pycelle, Qyburn, who had returned after some cryptic errands in the city, Ser Kevan, and other key figures. Across from them stood several Bolton men who had remained behind. They listened intently as she read Roose's letter aloud, leaving out only certain details about losses which she deemed unwise to share with the entire council. Ser Kevan spoke first. "Your Grace, if I may, this is precisely why I warned against overtaxing the North. The winter has made them more insular, and now if a Stark has truly emerged, are you blaming me for a northern rebellion?" Cersei snapped, setting the letter down. Her uncle kept his composure. "I only suggest that a more measured approach might have kept them in check. Fear alone is not always enough." She bristled, about to retort, but Qyburn's soft voice interceded. "Fear is an excellent tool, my lords, but it must be wielded with skill. The question is, how do we bolster Lord Bolton's efforts without sending half the capital's strength into the jaws of winter?" One of the Bolton men, a gaunt captain named Ronald, cleared his throat. "We could arrange supply convoys by sea, sailing to White Harbor or the coastal towns still loyal to Lord Bolton. From there, the provisions can move inland." Cersei's eyes flickered with interest. "White Harbor? The Manderleys still owe fealty to the Iron Throne, do they not?" The captain hesitated. "Officially, yes. But the Manderleys have not forgotten their old allegiance to the Starks. If they believe a Stark is truly calling banners, they might hesitate to receive Bolton forces." Qyburn tapped a slender finger on the table. "Still, it might be our best chance to resupply. There are other means to ensure their compliance." Pycelle cleared his throat nervously. "We do not have many ships to spare. The royal fleet was never fully rebuilt after the Blackwater. And if the Tyrells are withholding resources," Cersei exhaled slowly, pushing down the urge to lash out. "We'll conscript vessels from merchants, from any house that can spare them. Ramsay's men in the north can hold key positions along the King's Road as well, can they not?" A hush fell. Everyone recalled that Ramsay Snow, now legitimized as Ramsay Bolton, had once been the terror of the north. But the letter mentioned nothing of Ramsay. Rumors abounded that he had been sent on errands or that he died under mysterious circumstances. Roose had never clarified. The absence of that monstrous figure was notable, but none dared speak of it openly. Cersei broke the silence. "If Ramsay is still there, he can assist in forcing open the gates of the Manderleys, if it comes to that. For now, we will proceed with Captain Ronald's suggestion. Gather enough ships to move supplies north and impress upon the Manderleys the dire consequences of refusing us." The council murmured assent, though Ser Kevan's face remained troubled. The meeting adjourned, leaving the Queen Regent to brood over the uncertain news from the north. She could practically feel the realm shifting under her feet. The same question haunted her: was a single letter enough to rally the entire north? And if so, who stood behind it? In private, her mind churned through possible identities. Sansa Stark was rumored to be in the Vale under Peter Baelish's protection. Arya Stark was said to have vanished across the narrow sea or perhaps died. Bran and Rickon were believed dead, though some claimed they had escaped Winterfell. And there was the bastard Jon Snow, now Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, if rumors were true. Could he be leading a rebellion? If so, the Night's Watch was sworn not to take sides, but she knew from personal experience how vows could be broken. Or perhaps an impostor was invoking the Stark name. In any case, the message was dangerous, for it gave hope to the hopeless, a rallying cry for any who hated the Boltons. While she pondered this, word came that Margaery Tyrell desired an audience. Cersei considered refusing, but curiosity won out. She ordered the guards to admit Margaery to her solar, ensuring that at least 2 Bolton men stood watch discreetly in the corners. The Tyrell girl entered, cloaked in deep green, her hair carefully styled in elaborate braids. She curtsied with flawless grace. "Your Grace," she said in a voice neither overly submissive nor overtly challenging. "I appreciate you seeing me." Cersei remained seated, swirling wine in a golden goblet. "You wish to speak, Margaery?" A flicker of something passed over Margaery's features. "I came to beg your indulgence for the people of King's Landing. The new taxes on ships have led to a sharp rise in prices. The city is on the brink of famine. I have spoken to the High Septon's charity kitchens." Cersei's lips curled into a half-smile. "How noble of you to be so concerned about the smallfolk. I recall how well your charitable acts served you last time. Should I be worried that you intend to cloak yourself in piety once more?" Margaery lowered her eyes demurely. "I only wish to help the people. Surely we do not want unrest in the city." Cersei's gaze hardened. Unrest in the city is a lesser concern than a rebellion in the north. If the people must pay more for their bread, so be it. Do you plan to pay their taxes from your own coffers? Perhaps the Tyrell fortune is more than I recall. There was a subtle tensing in Margaery's posture, but her voice remained calm. "Highgarden has already pledged its resources to aid the crown. Perhaps if we could reopen negotiations? Cersei's laugh was sharp. "Do not mistake your presence here for a negotiation. You remain in King's Landing at my sufferance, not as an ambassador of the Reach. Unless your grandmother has decided to grace us with her presence to discuss finances, I see no reason to indulge you." Margaery bowed her head. "As you say, Your Grace." A few heartbeats passed in tense silence. The younger woman looked up, her brown eyes steady. "I do ask for one small favor. Allow me to organize a distribution of bread in the poorer districts. My house will bear the cost." Cersei studied her face. Was this genuine concern, or a ploy to win the people's favor and sow seeds of loyalty to House Tyrell? Likely the latter. Yet, ironically, the presence of charitable works might keep the city calmer, forestalling riots that Cersei had no desire to quell through open slaughter. After a pause, she gestured dismissively. "Very well. Distribute your bread. But do not let it be said you do so without the crown's blessing. Make it clear this comes by royal permission." Margaery inclined her head gracefully. "Of course, Your Grace." Without another word, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing in the corridor outside. Cersei exhaled slowly, her hand tightening on her goblet. Margaery's request might be helpful in the short term, but it grated on her nerves that the young woman would once again garner popular support. She made a mental note to have the distribution monitored. If Margaery tried to slip in anti-Lannister rhetoric or encourage hidden sedition, the Queen Regent would be informed immediately. That night, as Cersei sat alone at her window, she gazed out over the sprawling city. Lanterns flickered in the distance, illuminating narrow alleyways and hidden squares. She wondered how many conspiracies brewed below, quietly forging links among the discontented. The nights had grown longer, and a biting wind carried the promise of a winter that would, in time, affect even the south. And with every passing moment, news from the north remained uncertain. A fortnight after Roose had departed, a fresh letter arrived. This time, it brought more dire news. The Bolton forces had reached Moat Cailin, but the fortress was in rebel hands, manned by a small but resolute garrison loyal to the unknown Stark claimant. Attempts to parley had failed. The letter concluded with a curt request for more men, or at least more supplies. The original plan to rely on local provisioning had collapsed, and the northern lords were shutting their gates. Roose also mentioned that winter storms were hampering movement, and some of his outriders had been found dead in the snow, flayed and left as a message. It was a calculated response, an echo of Bolton cruelty turned back upon them. Cersei cursed aloud upon reading it. If the rebels were bold enough to mimic the Bolton signature act, the situation was more dire than she had imagined. The notion of a savage, winter-hardened rebellion made her skin crawl. She composed her reply, stating that ships would be sent to White Harbor. She added a warning that the Tyrell shipments were delayed so the supplies might take time. Finally, she urged Roose to put down the rebellion swiftly, no matter the cost. For if the North truly united under the Wolf banner, it could inspire the Vale, the Riverlands, and even the Stormlands to cast off the Lannister-Bolton yoke. With the message sent, all she could do was wait. In the intervening days, she busied herself with the petty intrigues of court, carefully monitoring Marjorie's bread distributions, meeting with the Master of Coin, and ensuring the City Watch remained loyal. She also ordered a new wave of arrests, a handful of suspected traitors, men who had been heard voicing discontent in taverns or rumored to be forging weapons for some hidden cause. Their interrogation took place in the depths of the Red Keep, a place that Qyburn had outfitted with implements that even the old black cells had never seen. The screams that filtered through the stone at night reminded everyone of the unstoppable wrath that governed King's Landing. Yet despite these acts, an undercurrent of defiance still pulsed in the city's veins. Graffiti appeared on certain walls at dawn, only to be scrubbed away by midday, a direwolf scrawled in charcoal or a mocking phrase about the flayed lion. Street performers whispered jokes about a queen who wet a corpse. The brave ones did so out of earshot of the guards. Cersei redoubled her efforts, but it was impossible to quell every whisper. The more she squeezed the city in her fist, the more certain pockets slipped through her grasp. Then came a night that would change everything in the capital. A gentle rain began in the late afternoon, pattering on the rooftops, turning the streets into slippery messes of mud and stone. By dusk, lightning flickered over the bay and thunder rolled across the sky. In the Red Keep, the Queen Regent finished her evening meal and prepared to retire, yet a strange restlessness gripped her. She dismissed her maids and wandered through the torchlit corridors alone, followed at a respectful distance by 2 Bolton guards. The night felt charged, as if a storm of more than mere weather was about to break. Her suspicions proved correct. Just past the hour of the bat, a frantic messenger arrived at the gates, demanding entry under the seal of House Lannister. Once inside, breathless and drenched from the rain, he recounted a shocking tale to the captain of the guard, who immediately rushed to find the queen. Cersei, roused from her bed, listened with mounting horror as the messenger described how a fleet of ships bearing the Flayed Man's sigil had been attacked off the coast near Cracklaw Point. The Crown's forcibly conscripted merchant ships, loaded with grain and supplies meant for the northern campaign, had been set upon by a mysterious force. Some claimed it was pirates from the Stepstones. Others whispered it might be a raid financed by the Tyrells or even the Iron Bank. Regardless, the result was the same. The ships were burned or captured and the supplies were lost to the depths. Cersei's face twisted in fury. Were there no survivors? She demanded. The messenger, trembling, nodded. A few managed to land on the shores. They told tales of black-sailed ships, no clear sigils, attacking without warning. They shot fire arrows and boarded swiftly. Then they vanished into the storm. A hush followed. This was no small setback. Those ships carried the hope of feeding Bolton's troops in the north. Without them, Roose would be stranded in a harsh winter with dwindling provisions. Cersei's mind spun through the possibilities. Could the Dornish have financed this attack? The Tyrells? Or was it the Iron Islands seeking to exploit a moment of weakness? It could even be an outlaw band capitalizing on the chaos. The realm was fracturing in the face of the Bolton Lannister regime's brutality. She forced herself to calm. Alert the city. Double the watch on the gates and the harbor. I will not have any more sabotage. Summon Ser Kevin, Qyburn, the Master of Coin. No, summon everyone. We must have answers. And you, she fixed the messenger with a glare, be ready to repeat every detail you heard from the survivors. The messenger bowed awkwardly. Why yes, your grace. Even as she turned away, the storm raged outside, thunder shaking the very foundations of the Red Keep. In that rumble, Cersei thought she heard the distant echoes of a war horn. A foolish fancy, perhaps, but it seeped into her bones like a warning. Another blow had been struck against her rule, just as the North threatened open rebellion. How many more would come? How many more cracks could appear before the edifice of her power crumbled? In a single, feverish night, the tenuous threads holding the realm together seemed poised to snap. And in the darkness, somewhere unseen, Cersei imagined faces bent over a table, planning the next strike against her. She pictured Marjorie Tyrell's secret smirk, the quiet defiance of the Northern Lords, the watchful eyes of the Iron Bank, the cunning mind of Peter Baelish wherever he might be, and the potent memory of the Stark name. For all her cunning, for all the cruelty she shared with her absent husband, she was beginning to fear that the realm was too vast, too wounded by war, to be truly subdued by terror alone. While the storm battered the city, word of the disaster at sea took flight among those who thrived on chaos. Gold cloaks patrolled the taverns, shutting down any talk of the burnt ships, but the rumors spread anyway. Some said the supplies had been stolen by the Tyrells, others insisted the Greyjoys had launched a surprise raid. A few even whispered that Daenerys Targaryen, the rumored mother of dragons across the narrow sea, had sent sails to weaken the Lannisters. Amid the swirl of theories, one fact stood unchallenged: the North would remain undersupplied, and Roose Bolton's position there was no doubt compromised. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the Red Keep, Margaery Tyrell, in the privacy of her borrowed chambers, received her own whispers. None of them confirmed the attacker's identity, but the news that the Northern supply fleet had been destroyed thrilled her hidden hopes. She had not personally arranged it, but it served her interests all the same. Depriving the Boltons of vital resources could only strengthen the possibility of rebellion in the North, which, in turn, might weaken Cersei's hold on the throne. Still, Margaery was cautious. With Bolton men scattered throughout the city, she dared not appear too pleased. She masked her satisfaction behind a show of piety, continuing her bread distribution for the poor, earning quiet gratitude from the small folk. In the early hours before dawn, Cersei met with Qyburn in a secluded corner of the Red Keep. The only illumination came from a single lantern, casting long shadows across the stone floor. She demanded answers. Any clue that might reveal who had attacked the ships. Qyburn, ever the picture of calm, confessed he could only gather fragments. Some survivors claimed the attackers wore no insignia, which meant they were likely mercenaries. Others said the ships were old, battered cogs fitted with rams, which might indicate a hidden cove off the rocky coast used by smugglers. None of it formed a coherent picture. "Your Grace," Qyburn said, inclining his head, "I suspect the money to hire such a force came from a powerful faction. Perhaps the Iron Bank decided to back a more pliable claimant. Or the Tyrells might have found a discreet way to strike. Even House Martell might be involved, though I've heard little from Dorne as of late." Cersei gritted her teeth. "We're surrounded by traitors and sharks. My father would have known whom to crush first. But Tywin is dead and the vultures gather." She lapsed into a brief silence, then waved a hand at Qyburn. "Continue your investigations. Torture if you must. Someone in the city must know something." He bowed, a glimmer of dark understanding in his eyes. "As you command, Your Grace." With that, he slipped away, leaving Cersei to the solitude of her roiling thoughts. She could not sleep that night. Instead, she remained by her window, glaring at the storm. She recalled the prophecy from her youth, spoken by Maggie the Frog, about a younger, more beautiful queen who would cast her down. She had always believed the queen to be Margaery Tyrell, but what if it was an even greater force, Daenerys Targaryen, or some unknown Stark girl? The prophecy was maddeningly vague, and Cersei hated its hold on her mind. She was determined to shape her own destiny, no matter what ancient words had been uttered in a musty tent long ago. As she finally closed her eyes near dawn, she dreamed of winter wolves howling beneath the Red Keep, their eyes shining with fierce triumph. She woke in a sweat, cursing the dream. It was only a dream, she told herself. Yet some part of her feared it might be an omen. The North was stirring, and if they had truly resurrected the spirit of House Stark, then perhaps no amount of flayed men or lion's gold could silence them. Weeks passed in tense uncertainty. The rains continued intermittently, interspersed with days of bitter cold. No more ships were burned, but that single attack had been enough to cripple the supply lines. Meanwhile, ravens flew in and out of the Red Keep bearing sporadic messages from Roose Bolton. The gist of each letter was the same: the rebellion was growing bolder. He pressed on despite ambushes and the inhospitable climate. Casualties rose, and his men were losing heart. The northern snows rendered cavalry almost useless. Even the hardened Bolton soldiers were not immune to the relentless chill, and local peasants refused to provide food or shelter. Though no major battle was reported, the war of attrition continued to sap the Bolton Lannister forces. As the situation deteriorated, Cersei found it harder to maintain calm in King's Landing. Tensions flared. At court, she doubled down on intimidation. Several prominent merchants accused of profiteering were arrested, their assets seized. A minor lord from the Crownlands who dared to criticize her policies was found dead in an alley, carved with the flayed man's symbol. Despite such measures, or perhaps because of them, the city seethed with discontent even as it feared her wrath. Margaery Tyrell continued her charitable works, carefully navigating the line between compassion and caution. The small folk adored her for it, though Cersei's network kept careful tabs on every step she took. Still, Cersei knew she could not move openly against Margaery, not unless the woman gave her a clear pretext. Making a martyr of the Tyrell princess could spark an outright revolt in the city, or at the very least give the Tyrells cause to invade from the Reach. So the Queen Regent bided her time, growing increasingly paranoid. Then, in a final stroke of misfortune, the Iron Bank delivered an ultimatum through their envoy. Enraged by the Crown's failure to service its debt and alarmed by the unrest that threatened to topple the monarchy, the bank declared it would suspend all credit to House Lannister and House Bolton. Furthermore, it hinted that it might offer loans to rival claimants if the current situation did not improve swiftly. The envoy delivered this news with the detached politeness of a man who held no personal stake in the matter, then departed the city before nightfall. Cersei received the news in her solar, her fists clenched. That same evening, she ordered Pycelle and the Master of Coin to conjure a new plan for repaying at least a portion of the debt. But the coffers were nearly empty. The gold mines in the Westerlands had run dry years ago, a fact her father had closely guarded. The Tyrells would not lend her so much as a single gold dragon now. The Vale was aloof, Dorne was hostile, and the North was a war zone. Her only remaining option was to squeeze the Crownlands and Riverlands further and approach that threatened revolt. It was a deadlock, pushing her deeper into a spiral of fury and desperation. On the eve of the year's first heavy snow in the capital, a rare occurrence that set tongues wagging, Cersei received yet another dispatch from Roose Bolton. It was terse, as though penned in haste. The rebel host has taken Winterfell. Most of the local houses have sworn fealty to them, believing they fight under a Stark banner. The city and the castle are heavily fortified. My scouts speak of more forces converging from the western mountains. The snows are too deep to attempt a siege without proper supplies. Unless we receive relief, we may be forced to retreat south to the Dreadfort or risk being stranded. His words read like an admission of looming defeat. The mighty Roose Bolton, flayer of men and orchestrator of betrayals, had encountered a foe that no cruelty or cunning could easily dismantle, a united North driven by the indomitable memory of House Stark. Cersei felt a flash of panic at the thought of him withdrawing to the Dreadfort. If he lost the North entirely, what would stop those rebel forces from marching south? The Vale might join them, then the Riverlands. The entire realm could erupt, toppling the precarious throne that she had fought so hard to secure. And so, with the city on the edge of chaos, the North in open defiance, and the Iron Bank threatening to fund her enemies, Cersei Lannister stood on a razor's edge. Her only ally was a man locked in a losing campaign, hundreds of leagues away, beset by Winter's cruel hand. She had traded everything, her dignity, her father's legacy, even her morality, for an alliance that had promised unassailable power. Now it seemed that alliance might be dissolving in the snows, leaving her more vulnerable than ever. Yet desperation breeds invention, and fear can become a catalyst for unthinkable acts. The realm held its breath, uncertain if the Queen Regent would lash out in one final, savage attempt to quell her enemies, or if she would broker some cunning truce that might save her rule. In the hidden corners of King's Landing and beyond, conspirators sharpened their knives while lords weighed their loyalties against a growing sense that the tide was turning. If House Stark was truly returned, if the Lion and the Flayed Man were about to be driven from the North, what might come next? Civil war seemed inevitable, but so did the possibility of a new dawn for Westeros. One free of the cruelty that had stained the realm ever since Roose Bolton and Cersei Lannister stood side by side in the Great September of Baelor and proclaimed their unholy union. In the meantime, the snows drifted down over King's Landing, settling upon rooftops and windowsills as the night deepened. By morning, the city woke to a strange, pale hush, as though nature itself had imposed a kind of truce. But beneath that surface calm, the fires of rebellion smoldered. The Queen Regent stood at her window, gazing down at the white-blanketed streets. Somewhere in that labyrinth of alleys and squares, destinies were colliding, and the fate of her reign hung in the balance. Far to the north, a man whose name was whispered in fear fought a battle against an enemy he could not easily flay into submission. And behind it all loomed the inexorable approach of a new winter, both literal and metaphorical, that threatened to reshape the Seven Kingdoms in ways no one, lion, flayed man, or wolf could fully predict.